Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. One of our viewers recently asked me to do a comparison between Bulgaria and Portugal. Obviously, both places that could appeal to somebody who is wanting to go and relocate to some other particular country for a period of time, or maybe for a long term. So I'm going to cover those today, discussing, which is better to visit, which is better to live in, why, and just generally who they're better for, what situation they're better for, etc. So we're going to dive into that subject. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, nail the notification bell, hit that little all icon so that you make sure you don't miss out on any of our future videos. Check out some of the others if you would like them. And if you would like help with these subjects of international tax optimization, where to move, how to get set up there, what residencies to get, what citizenships, what is best for you, or help actually getting those residencies, citizenships, tax optimization, etc., please book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. We also have links to our website, offshorecitizen.net or offshorecapitalist.com, in the links below, so you can visit us there and send us a message through either of those platforms. Okay, so this is an interesting one because I have a very close friend who relocated a couple years ago from Bulgaria to Portugal, and it was a fun little comparison at the time, going through, all right, what do you like about Bulgaria? What do you dislike about Bulgaria? What do you like about Portugal? What do you dislike about Portugal? And making the change. And just kind of to put some context around it, because some people might say, oh, well, clearly it's better because you left and went to Portugal. He was gay, and so that was part of his factor. And so that's it's a worthy consideration, right? If you're gay, probably the culture in Bulgaria is not as good for you as the culture in Portugal, which is, really friendly towards gay people. And so that's something that is worth considering. This being said, let's go through a variety of different criteria, starting with the climate. And I think for most people, the climate differences are probably pretty obvious. I would say that Portugal clearly wins. The weather is, okay, if you like the cold and you like to go skiing, then you're going to get more of that in Bulgaria than you're going to get in Portugal, for sure. But generally speaking, you have an ability to escape and go into some areas of Portugal that are cooler during the summer. Maybe, you don't like that as much. The Porto area is certainly cooler than the Lisbon area, just depending on what you like, but, something to consider. Bulgaria is not crazy bad. It's fairly mild winters. It's definitely not super severe, although keep in mind, I'm from Canada, so, my idea of severe winters may be quite a bit more severe than your idea of severe winters. This being said, clearly it's just much, much, much more mild and much warmer in Portugal than it is in Bulgaria, even on the coast, where, you have some nice coastal experiences. Speaking of coastal experiences, the coast in both, the beaches, I would say, in neither place are really amazing. It's probably better for swimming in Bulgaria than it is in Portugal, simply because the Black Sea is generally going to be a little bit warmer than the Atlantic, which is freezing. However, you have the amazing surfing, best surfing in the world in Portugal by many measures, so that's something to consider. And I would say that although those beaches offer warmer water in the Black Sea, the general coastline of Portugal is more beautiful, in my opinion. That's, again, depending on what you prefer. I tend to like the coastlines in general, but yeah, I would say that overall you have maybe a little bit more attractive, kind of some rock formations and, hidden areas that are pretty nice and cool in Portugal versus Bulgaria. Next, let's talk about taxes, since we talk lots about taxes here. So Portugal's taxes are normally horrific. Okay, they're really, really bad. Probably some of the worst in Europe. They're terrible. It's very high. It's just a terrible tax place. However, you have the non-habitual residency regime. So for 10 years, you can get these various tax favorable consequences, which I've done some previous videos on. You can go and check them out. I've gone through kind of in detail. If you're retired, you're talking about 10% tax. In certain cases, you can end up at zero. Most of the time, you won't end up at zero. Most of the time, you'll end up with some tax. If you have some sort of earned income, it's 20% plus socials, not so good. Capital gains, 28%. Some of these things, not amazing, but not terrible either, right? Like, you can definitely get some good tax treatment. If we're talking about long-term holds for crypto, then crypto's zero tax. So a lot of crypto people have been going to Portugal. In Bulgaria, by contrast, it's a flat tax, 10% for regular income, 5% for dividends. Pretty good, right? Pretty good. You can use kind of some ways of structuring to make it certain. You really shouldn't have to pay more than 7.5% tax. That's what I always tell people. So 7.5%, pretty attractive, right? Definitely in line with what most people are going to get in Portugal. Not as low for certain things, but if, for example, you were a full-time trader, you're going to get taxed potentially quite heavily in Portugal, whereas, hey, you can end up with potentially 7.5% tax in Bulgaria. If you were, doing some sort of active like yield farming, staking, like all the types of stuff that would normally be taxable in Portugal, you're better off in Bulgaria. So that's a contrast that is worth considering, okay? Bulgaria is also way easier to do the taxes. So the tax structure in Bulgaria is much, much easier than the tax structure in Portugal. Portugal, you have to worry about these little holes and making sure that you're fitting together accordingly. So something to consider. What about in terms of costs? Bulgaria is definitely cheaper, right? Portugal is not a super expensive place, although the price of real estate in cities like Lisbon have gone up a lot over the last number of years. Bulgaria is a pretty cheap country, basically the cheapest country in the EU, I believe. I don't think really, maybe Romania is competitive with it. Arguably, there's very few that compete with it in Europe, period. If you want to kind of consider, okay, Northern Macedonia maybe is a little bit cheaper, Albania, places like that, but not dramatically so. So you can live, I would say that for an equivalent place in an equivalent location, you're probably looking at about half price for rent in Bulgaria versus Portugal, something like that. Food, you're talking about, again, probably like it's definitely cheaper. On the other hand, your selection of things like fresh seafood is really good in Portugal. I would say that the food scene is better there, although again, you don't have like a super high-end food scene in Portugal, maybe a function of a relatively small population. Bulgaria has a good mid-range food scene, except for beef. Beef is mostly terrible. There's a couple exceptions to that, but pretty much beef is awful in Bulgaria. So, again, I'd say the food scene is slightly better in Portugal than it is in Bulgaria. However, the costs are somewhat lower in Bulgaria than they are in Portugal. So if you're looking for lower costs, Bulgaria is definitely more for you. What about kind of entertainment things to do? Generally speaking, the population of Sofia, for example, is quite a bit higher than the population of Lisbon. And so just in terms of nightlife things to do from that standpoint, I would say it's culturally better in Bulgaria. This being said, if you're talking about having kind of like events and people coming through there, etc., more tends to get hosted in Portugal. Okay, so it's more likely that you're going to have conferences and things. Obviously, conferences have been restricted in the last year. But that being said, more of these conferences, etc., in Portugal. Both are pretty well connected by air. There's a lot of low-cost flights from Bulgaria. Depending on where you want to go, it could be more or less convenient, right? To go from Lisbon to the eastern US, definitely more convenient than going from Bulgaria. On the other hand, if you wanted to go from Bulgaria to, Asia, Dubai, something like that, more convenient to go from Bulgaria. So, things like that, it's pretty comparable. I think a lot of people from UK really like Portugal because of the easy access to London, or just UK in general. It's a very short flight. So comparatively speaking, again, you have an advantage. Definitely English is better in Portugal than it is in Bulgaria. I'd say it's improving in Bulgaria. Even over the time that I've lived in Bulgaria, I've noticed an improvement. So that's something to consider. Infrastructure, definitely better in Portugal than it is in Bulgaria. Healthcare, somewhat better, I would say, in Portugal than in Bulgaria. Education, I can't really speak to. I haven't gone through those. As I understand it from looking at different people's experience, it seems to depend on what your field of study is, which one might make the most sense for you. So again, worth considering. What else have we got? We need to talk about just touristy things to do. So in terms of culture as a place to visit, things to explore, etc., I would say there tends to be more in Portugal by a fair margin. Like if I was going to ask, if somebody was asking me, hey, where should I visit as a tourist? I would generally say go to Portugal versus Bulgaria. That being said, it depends a little. I find that the exterior culture is warmer in Portugal. One of the things I've talked quite a bit about is how in Eastern Europe in general, you get quite a cold exterior culture. You have to get to know people. Once you get to know them, they warm up and they're friendly and they're caring and things like this. But the surface level is not good, and the service is definitely much worse on average. Of course, any given restaurant, I was just at a place with some clients the other evening, last night I guess it was, and service was great, right? We had a good experience. So not to say that that doesn't exist, of course it does, but the average experience tends to be more attentive and responsive in Portugal than it is in Bulgaria. So that gives you like a bit of an overview of some of the things that you may want to consider. In terms of something like IT infrastructure, it is definitely better, it's definitely good in both, is I guess what I would say. If I was going to hire people, although I think that it's great to hire Portuguese people remotely, you can get, kind of some creative types and things like this. Just because of the socials being so bad, it generally works out better to hire people in Bulgaria. So that's something, of course, I would consider both, but definitely your cost of hiring people, having an office, etc., is going to be lower in Bulgaria than it will be in Portugal. The big advantage, I think, of Portugal is for if you're somebody who wants to work towards a passport. Bulgaria mostly doesn't allow dual citizenship, whereas Portugal does. And Portugal's passport is much better than Bulgaria's passport, although they're both pretty good passports. Portugal is definitely tier 1, and Bulgaria is like that little bit down. Not mainly the big thing is it doesn't have access to the US, so worth considering. I hope that gives you some idea. I would love to hear you guys' opinion. What do you think? Portugal, Bulgaria, which one do you like most? Why do you like it most? What about to travel? What about to live there? And yeah, put your comments below. If you have questions, put them in the comments below. And I'm going to look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.